The letter hit the kitchen table like a slap. Lena Ashcroft, 11 years old and already too familiar with bad news, watched the woman across the table read it twice. Maeve Holloway didn't tremble. She didn't cry. She set the paper down, folded it once along the crease like it was something ordinary, and said 4 words that turned the room to ice. "You need to leave." Not to Lena, to her father. Gideon Ashcroft had spent 6 months bleeding for this ranch hug, his hand split open by frozen rope, his back wrecked from hauling feed through snowdrifts taller than his daughter. And the man holding the pen behind that letter, Maeve's brother-in-law, Raymond Holloway, had decided that was precisely long enough for a drifter to become a threat. What happened next? Nobody in Ridgeback County ever forgot. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel tells the stories of ordinary people forced into impossible choices. If that speaks to you, hit subscribe and stay until the end. Drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all started. The wagon gave out 3 miles past the tree line. It didn't happen dramatically. There was no crack of thunder, no sudden lurch. The left rear wheel simply sank into a frozen rut, and when Gideon slapped the reins and the mule leaned into the pull, something inside the axle housing gave a low, grinding moan, the sound of metal that had been asked to do too much for too long, and the whole rear corner dropped. The wagon listed hard. A crate slid off the back and burst open on the road, scattering the last of their canned goods across the snow like an insult. Gideon sat there with the reins still in his hands. For a moment he didn't move. He just looked at the road ahead, which disappeared into a gray curtain of falling snow, and at the road behind, which disappeared into the same. The pines on either side stood close and heavy with ice. Nothing moved except the snow itself drifting sideways in the wind. Behind him, from under a canvas tarp in the wagon bed, a small voice said, "Dad?" "I know," he said. "How bad is it?" He climbed down without answering. He crouched beside the wheel, shoved his fingers into the packed snow beneath the axle, felt around until he found what he already suspected. The housing had cracked. Not chipped, not bent. Cracked through the way cast iron cracks when it's been cold too long and pushed too hard. He sat back on his heels and let out a breath that went white in the air and dissolved. Lena appeared at the side of the wagon. She was wearing 2 coats, his old one over her own, and her hat was pulled so low that only the bottom half of her face showed. Her nose was red. She looked at the wheel, then at him. "Can you fix it?" "Not out here." She looked at the trees. She was 11, but she'd been traveling with him long enough that she didn't ask stupid questions. She didn't ask how far back to town. She didn't ask why they hadn't stayed. She already knew the answer to both. The town of Creel's Ford had burned 4 months ago. Not a fire exactly, though 2 buildings did catch. More of a slow collapse. The mill closed first, then the bank, then the families started leaving, and by October there was nothing left to stay for. Their house had been among the last standing, but a house without a town around it is just a cold building in the dark. He'd loaded what he could. Lena. The mule. A crate of supplies and a canvas roll with his tools. A photograph of her mother that he kept inside his coat pocket, close to his chest, the way you carry something that can't be replaced. The plan had been to reach his wife's cousin in a settlement called Dunmore, 2 days east. They had a letter. They had an invitation, sort of. A response to his own letter, 3 sentences long, that said, "Come if you need to, we have room in the barn." He had folded that letter and kept it beside the photograph. 2 pieces of paper. That was the entirety of their future. Now the axle was cracked and the snow was picking up and the mule was standing with his head down, not moving, which was a bad sign because the mule almost never stopped moving unless conditions were genuinely miserable. "There's smoke," Lena said. He looked where she was pointing. Through the trees to the north, barely visible through the curtain of snow, a thin dark thread rose into the gray sky and bent sideways in the wind. Gideon looked at it for a long moment. He thought about a lot of things in that moment. He thought about what kind of people lived this far out on a mountain road in November. He thought about what they might want in exchange for shelter. He thought about the $4.60 in his coat pocket, which was everything he had. He thought about Lena's hands, which had been cold since morning even inside her mittens. "Get your bag," he said. Bum. They left the wagon in the road. He unhooked the mule and led him by the bridle, walking into the trees toward the smoke. Lena walked beside him with her hand through his arm, not holding his hand. She was too old for that now, she'd told him so in September, but close enough that her shoulder pressed against his sleeve with every step. The ranch appeared slowly, the way things appear in heavy snow. First a shape, then details. A fence line, a gate with a wooden crossbar, a long, low barn with lamplight leaking under the door. Beyond it, a house. 2 stories, stone foundation, the kind of house that was built to outlast the people inside it. He stopped at the gate. There was no sign, no welcome of any kind. A dog started barking from somewhere inside the barn. A deep, no-nonsense bark, and didn't stop. Lena said, "Should we knock?" "That's generally how it works." She made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been her teeth chattering. He pushed the gate open. Before he'd taken 3 steps up the path, the front door of the house opened. The woman who came out didn't have a coat on. She stood on the porch in a canvas shirt with the sleeves rolled to her elbows, like the cold hadn't bothered to introduce itself to her. She was somewhere past 40, maybe well past. Her hair was pulled back with no ceremony, dark streaked through with iron gray. She held a rifle, not raised, just held, loosely in her right hand, the barrel pointed at the ground with a kind of casual competence that said she'd done this many times and expected to do it many more. She looked at him. She looked at Lena. She looked at the mule. "Gate was closed for a reason," she said. "I know it," Gideon said. "We had a breakdown on the road. My daughter's cold." A pause. The woman's eyes moved back to Lena, and something crossed her face. Not softness exactly, more like a recalibration. She was the kind of woman who looked at a situation and added up what it meant quickly without wasting time. "How old is she?" 11. "What road?" "Ridgeback cutoff, about 3 miles back toward the pass." "That road's been unpassable since the 10th. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. "It was close to unpassable," he admitted. "We found out for certain when the axle cracked." The woman looked at him for a long time. The dog was still barking inside the barn. Without turning her head, she said, very calmly, "Enough, Biscuit." The barking stopped. She looked back at Gideon. "What's your name?" "Gideon Ashcroft. This is my daughter Lena." "Where are you headed?" "Dunmore, my wife's cousin. We have a letter." "Dunmore's 2 days in good weather. You're not going anywhere in this." "I know that too." Another pause. Longer. She was deciding something, and she didn't rush it, and he didn't push. He'd learned a long time ago that pushing a decision toward you didn't make it go your way. It just made people feel pressured, and pressured people made worse choices for everyone. Finally, she said, "There's a room off the back of the barn. Straw's clean. You can put your mule in with the others." She looked at Lena again. "She can sleep in the house. I have a spare room." Lena looked at her father. Gideon said, "We stay together." The woman looked at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not irritation, not surprise, something more like assessment. "Suit yourself," she said. "Room's big enough for 2 if you don't mind close quarters. Supper's in an hour. I don't hold plates." She turned and walked back inside without waiting for an answer. Gideon stood there with the mule's bridle in his hand and snow collecting on his shoulders. Lena said quietly, "She's a little scary." "She's warm and she has walls," he said. "That makes her wonderful right now." Her name was Maeve Holloway. He learned that from a hand-lettered board above the barn door. Black Ridge Ranch. M. Holloway. Prop. He learned the rest at supper. There were 2 ranch hands eating at the kitchen table when he and Lena came in from settling the mule. One was a big, slow-moving man named Dolph, who barely looked up. The other was younger, maybe 17, thin and watchful, who introduced himself as Cal and then stared at Lena for a full 10 seconds before going back to his food. Maeve set a pot of beans and a pan of cornbread on the table and sat down without fanfare. She didn't explain the food or apologize for it or offer anything extra. She just ate. Lena, who had been raised with enough manners to make her mother proud, said, "Thank you for having us." Maeve looked at her. "Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow you'll earn your keep." Lena blinked. She wasn't offended. Gideon could tell by the way she tilted her head, more curious than hurt. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't run a charity. Your father can work. You can work. You'll eat what you earn." She looked at Gideon. "That acceptable to you?" "More than acceptable," he said. She nodded and went back to eating. Around the table, nobody talked much. Dolph ate steadily and mechanically, the way a big man eats when he's been outside in the cold all day. Cal kept stealing glances at Lena until Gideon gave him a look that made him stop. Outside, the wind had picked up and was throwing itself against the windows in gusts. Lena ate 2 bowls of beans and 3 pieces of cornbread and fell asleep in the chair before the meal was fully cleared. Gideon carried her to the barn room, tucked her in under the blanket Maeve had put out without being asked, and sat on the edge of the cot for a while. He could hear the wind outside. He could hear the horses shifting in their stalls. He could hear his daughter's breathing, slow and steady, the way children breathe when they finally stop bracing for the next bad thing. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. He'd been trying not to count how close they'd come. The wagon. The pass. If the axle had gone another mile back, they'd have been on exposed ground with no shelter visible. He'd been in cold like this before. He knew what it did. He pulled the photograph from his coat pocket. He didn't look at it exactly. He knew every detail already, had memorized them so thoroughly, the physical image felt almost redundant. But he held it. "I'm keeping her safe," he thought. "I'm trying." He wasn't sure if that thought was a promise or an apology. The next morning, Maeve put him to work before the sun was fully up. She walked him through what needed doing with the brisk efficiency of someone who had stopped explaining things twice years ago. The east fence had 3 broken posts from where a branch had come down under the weight of ice. The barn roof had a section where the shingles had lifted and needed to be nailed back before the next snowfall worked its way underneath. 2 of the water troughs were frozen solid and needed to be broken out and the heating stones repositioned. The generator that ran the small, inadequate furnace in the house had been running rough since October, and she needed him to look at it when everything else was done. She didn't ask if he knew how to do any of it. She told him and walked away. He found out within the first hour that she had not overestimated him exactly, but had assumed competence at a level that forced him to work at the top of what he actually knew. The fence posts were straightforward. The shingles were worse than described. The underlying board had rotted in 2 places and needed to be replaced, not just reshingled, which meant a trip up the ladder in wind that wanted to take him off the roof. He did it anyway. He wasn't going to be the man who came back inside and said it was worse than expected. He was finishing the water trough when Lena appeared, wearing her 2 coats and carrying a bucket. "She told me to bring fresh water from the pump," Lena said. She looked at the trough, at the ice he'd been breaking with a steel rod. "Can I help?" "You're already helping. Get the pump going." She went to work without complaint. The pump was stiff in the cold. It took both hands and her full body weight on the handle. But she got it running. Maeve appeared at the barn door 20 minutes later. She looked at the trough, at the broken ice, at Lena working the pump. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said to Lena, "Straighten your stance. You're wasting effort. Put your weight through your hips, not your shoulders." Lena adjusted. The handle moved more easily. "Better," Maeve said. She was already walking away. Lena looked at Gideon. He kept his face neutral. But something about the exchange sat with him all morning. The way Maeve had stopped, the way she'd looked at Lena. Not warmth, not exactly, but attention. The specific quality of attention that means a person is seeing something worth seeing. Oh, the days took on a shape. Gideon worked from before sunup until dark. He fixed what was broken, and when everything visible was fixed, he started on the things that were broken, but not yet visible. The loose boards in the hayloft, the cracked hinge on the barn side door, the stretch of fence along the north field that was still standing but wouldn't be for long if another hard storm came through. He didn't ask Maeve for direction. He walked the property and used his own eyes and worked until his hands stopped hurting, which was to say he worked until he stopped noticing the pain. He had been a freight hauler for 12 years, Before that, a farmhand. Before that, a boy who grew up on a property a lot like this one, in a state he hadn't seen since he was 19. He knew how ranches worked. He knew what happened when maintenance got deferred, and weather didn't wait for better timing. And he knew, without being told, that Maeve Holloway had been running this place short-handed for long enough that the deferred list was getting dangerous. He didn't say any of this to her. He just worked his way through it. By the end of the third day, Dolph had stopped ignoring him. By the end of the week, Cal was following him around with a second set of tools. Not because anyone told him to, but because he'd noticed that Gideon's approach to problems was worth watching. Maeve noticed all of this. He could tell because she had the quality of someone who noticed everything and said only a fraction of what she noticed. She watched him the way a person watches weather, not with judgment, just with attention, adding information, waiting to see what it would mean. On the fifth evening, she sat down next to him on the porch steps after supper. They sat in silence for a minute. Inside, Lena was helping Cal wash dishes, which was something that had happened by accident 2 days ago and had apparently become a routine. Maeve said, "Where'd you learn to work like that?" He thought about it. "Watching people who knew better, doing it wrong until I stopped doing it wrong." She made a sound that might have been agreement. "Axle on your wagon," she said. "I had Dolph ride out and look at it. The housing's gone, but the wheel itself is sound. I have a spare housing in the back of the equipment shed. Cast iron, should fit." He looked at her. "You didn't have to do that." "I know it." She was quiet for a moment. "You could fix it yourself if you had the time. Dolph can help you. Probably take 2 days." "When do you want me to start?" She looked out at the dark tree line. "When the fence along the north field is done," she said. "Not before." He nodded. She stood up. She was almost to the door when she said, without turning around, "You said Dunmore. Your wife's people." "Her cousin. Yes. You have a letter from them." "I do." She was quiet for a moment. "Your wife. How long ago?" 3 years in January." Another silence. Then, "Dunmore isn't going anywhere. Neither is that letter." She opened the door. "You can stay until spring if the work holds. Figure the rest out when the pass clears." She went inside. Gideon sat on the steps with his hands hanging between his knees. The wind had dropped off, which almost never happened at this elevation in November. The sky between the pines was absolutely black and absolutely clear, and the stars were the kind of brilliant that made you feel very small and very awake at the same time. He thought about spring. He thought about how it had sounded. Not an offer, not charity, just a statement of possibility, as practical and unsentimental as everything else she did. You can stay until spring, like an arrangement between people who had earned a minimal degree of mutual trust and could see the practical value of extending it. He thought about Lena, inside at the sink, making Cal laugh about something. He thought about his daughter's voice, which had been very quiet since October and had started, somewhere in the last few days, to lose that particular tightness. He didn't make any decisions that night. He was too tired and too careful for decisions. But he stayed on the steps for a long time, looking at the stars. The north fence took 4 days, not 2. It wasn't that Gideon worked slowly. It was that the ground had frozen harder than expected in the section closest to the tree line, and setting posts in frozen ground without the right equipment meant improvising, heating the soil with coals wrapped in burlap, digging by hand in shifts, packing the holes with a mixture of gravel and thawed mud that would refreeze solid overnight. It was the kind of work that looked simple from a distance and was brutal up close, and by the end of the second day, his shoulders had developed a deep, grinding ache that didn't go away when he stopped working. It just moved inward, like it was trying to become permanent. Dolph worked beside him without complaint, which Gideon respected. The big man didn't talk much, but he read the work the same way Gideon did. Looking ahead to what was coming, positioning himself where he'd be most useful before anyone asked. They didn't need to say much to each other. That was its own kind of ease. Cal helped when he wasn't needed elsewhere, which wasn't often. Maeve kept the boy moving. Firewood, livestock checks, hauling feed, small repairs that never seemed to stop multiplying. Cal complained about it under his breath in the evenings in a way that was more performance than genuine grievance, the way young men complain when they're secretly satisfied to have a full day's worth of purpose. Lena had found her own rhythm by then. Maeve put her on morning chores with a specificity that surprised Gideon. Not help out, but exact tasks, in exact order, with exact standards. The water buckets filled to the third ring. The stall bedding turned, not just fluffed, the grain measured, not scooped by feel. Lena, who had inherited her mother's stubborn streak and her father's practical instincts, took to it the way she took to most things that demanded accuracy. Seriously, and with a quiet determination that occasionally tipped into perfectionism. The first time she did it wrong, Maeve didn't let it slide. It was the grain measurement. Lena had eyeballed it for the 2 goats at the end of the row, and Maeve came through on her check and saw it without being told. She didn't raise her voice. She just stood at the stall and said, "Do it again." Lena said, "I was close." Close doesn't keep animals healthy through a winter. Do it again. There was a beat of silence. Gideon was 3 stalls down and kept his eyes on what he was doing. He could feel his daughter deciding something. Lena did it again, properly this time. Maeve moved on without another word. Later that evening, Lena came and sat beside her father on the cot in the barn room, and she was quiet for a while in the way that meant she was turning something over. He waited. "She doesn't give you credit for trying," Lena finally said. "No," he agreed. "That's kind of harsh." He thought about it. "Or it means she thinks you're capable of doing it right. People who think you can't do something just let you be wrong." He looked at her. "She didn't let you be wrong." Lena considered this. He could almost see her filing it somewhere, the way she filed things that didn't fit her existing understanding, not discarding them, just holding them until the right place appeared. She said, "She's still kind of scary." "She's still warm and she has walls," he said. This time Lena actually laughed. The wagon repair took 2.5 days once the fence was done. Dolph had dragged the whole rig up to the equipment shed on the back of the workhorse, which was a considerable feat. The housing was where Maeve had said, back of the shed, wrapped in burlap, the right diameter. It had been sitting there long enough to collect dust, but it was sound. Gideon cleaned it, measured it twice, and spent the better part of the first day working the old cracked housing off without damaging the wheel assembly, which required patience he didn't entirely feel but had learned to perform convincingly. He was on his back under the wagon frame, working a bolt that had been rusted in place since what felt like the previous decade, when he heard footsteps and looked over to find Maeve crouching at the edge of the workspace watching. "Penetrating oil," she said. "I used it." 10 minutes isn't long enough. Leave it. Do something else. Come back." He wanted to say he knew that, but the truth was he'd been impatient with this particular bolt because it was the last one and he could see the end of the job from here, and impatience was how you stripped threads. He came out from under the wagon, set down the wrench, and went to help Cal with the firewood without saying anything about it. When he came back an hour later, the bolt turned on the second try. He didn't mention this to Maeve, but that evening at supper he noticed she'd put a slightly larger portion in his bowl than usual, and he thought that might be her version of acknowledgement. It was also possible he was reading too much into bean portions. That was the thing about Maeve Holloway. She operated in a register so understated that you weren't always certain whether you were receiving communication or inventing it. It kept him slightly off balance, which he suspected might be intentional. The wagon was road-ready by the third afternoon. He stood back and looked at it, and the feeling that moved through him was not entirely uncomplicated. The wagon being fixed meant Dunmore was again a real destination, not just a letter in his pocket. It meant spring wasn't the only option. It meant the practical reason to stay was shrinking. He was still standing there when Maeve came out of the barn and stopped beside him. "Holds up?" she said. "Should hold up fine. Better than before, probably." The old housing was already worn down before it cracked. She nodded. She looked at the wagon with her hands in her coat pockets. After a moment, she said, "Roads won't clear before March, maybe April, depending on the pass." "I know. Work's not running out." He looked at her. She was looking at the wagon. "That letter'll keep," she said. It was the same thing she'd said on the porch 2 weeks ago, almost word for word, and he understood that this was not carelessness on her part. She was saying it again deliberately. giving him something to hold on to, or maybe just confirming that the offer still stood. "I appreciate that," he said. She turned and walked back toward the house. He watched her go, and he thought, not for the first time, but that she was one of the loneliest people he'd ever met, and that she had arranged her entire life so that loneliness could not be identified as loneliness, which he understood because he had tried to do the same thing for 3 years and had only partially succeeded. The storms in December came in pairs. One would blow through for 2 or 3 days, drop a foot of snow, and move east, and before the sky was fully clear, the next one would be building on the western horizon. Maeve tracked them the way some people track news, with close, practiced attention and a kind of resigned acceptance that the information wouldn't change what was coming, but might change how prepared you were for it. She had a barometer on the kitchen wall that Gideon came to think of as a secondary member of the household. She checked it morning and evening, tapping the glass with one knuckle and reading the needle with an expression of steady concentration. When the needle dropped sharply, she went into a different mode. Not panic, never panic, but a compressed efficiency, moving through a mental checklist with speed that assumed everyone around her would keep up. During the first major storm of December, she stood at the kitchen window at 5 in the morning and said, without preamble, to the room in general, Gideon, Cal, and Dolph were at the table with coffee. "Dolph, I need the generator fuel topped off before 8. Cal, double the hay on the cattle. Check the water heating stones before you leave the barn." She looked at Gideon. "Roof on the chicken coop has been questionable since October. Today's the day we find out." He went to check the chicken coop roof. She was right. The front section had enough give in the boards that a heavy snow load would bring it down onto the birds. He spent 4 hours in the beginning of that storm, reinforcing it from above while the wind tried to rearrange him, and he finished with numb hands and a small gash on his forearm from a roofing nail that had not cooperated. And when he came in and reported it done, Maeve looked at his arm and said, "Sit down," and cleaned and wrapped it without fuss. Her hands were steady and efficient. Not gentle exactly, but not careless either. She used just the right amount of pressure and tied the bandage with a practiced knot. He said, "You've done this before." "Ranch work involves blood," she said. "You either learn to deal with it, or you get someone else to learn to deal with it." She cut the bandage end cleanly. "There was a husband who could do it better than me. Now there isn't." She said it the way someone says a plain fact about the weather. She was already putting the kid away. He understood from the way she said it and the way she immediately moved on that this was the closest she was going to come to talking about that subject, and he didn't push, but it sat with him. The husband. The was. He'd noticed no photographs in the house, which either meant she didn't have them or had put them away, and he suspected the latter from the way the walls in the kitchen had slightly lighter squares where things had clearly hung. He'd noticed that she slept downstairs, in a room off the kitchen, in a house that had a full upstairs with multiple rooms. He'd noticed that she never talked about the past except in relation to the land, the fence that had stood since her father-in-law's time, the water system that had been improved twice, the north pasture that had been better grazing before a summer drought 4 years ago shifted the grass patterns. The ranch was her history. Everything else had been edited out. He understood that kind of editing. He'd done his own version of it. Lena had her first real argument with Maeve on a Thursday in the second week of December, and Gideon was grateful he was in the equipment shed when it happened. He heard about it from Cal, who had been in the barn, and had therefore heard the whole thing with the focused attention of a 17-year-old who found other people's conflicts deeply entertaining. "Miss Maeve told her to put the saddle on old Bram," Cal said, not quite successfully hiding his enjoyment of the retelling. "And Lena said she didn't know how, and Miss Maeve said that was the whole point. And Lena said maybe she could watch first, and Miss Maeve said, watching doesn't teach your hands anything, and then Lena said—" He paused, apparently still processing the magnitude of what Lena had said. She said, "You're teaching me the wrong way." Gideon put down his wrench. "She said that?" "Yes, sir. Said she'd watched you lift things a dozen times before you made her try it herself, and she learned better that way." "What did Maeve say?" She was quiet for about 10 seconds. Then she said, "Show me how your father showed you to do it." Cal shook his head in a way that conveyed reluctant respect. "And Lena showed her, and Miss Maeve watched. And then she said, 'All right, But watch for this. And she corrected one thing about the cinch, and then Lena saddled Bram herself. Correct. First try. Gideon went back to the wrench. That's something, Cal said, in a tone that suggested he wasn't sure what it was. It is, Gideon agreed. That evening he watched Lena and Maeve at supper without being obvious about it. They sat across from each other, and there was something different in the air between them. Not warmth, still not that, but a renegotiation. Like two people who had each demonstrated something to the other and were still quietly deciding what it meant. Maeve, near the end of the meal, said to Lena, "You did the cinch right today." Lena said, "I know. I also did it right the second time you had me check it." Dolph choked slightly on his coffee. Cal stared at his bowl. Maeve looked at Lena for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not displeasure, more like surprise that had been quickly mastered. "That's true," she said. And that was the end of it. But afterward, washing up, Gideon heard Maeve say quietly to no one visible. She was alone in the kitchen, and he was in the doorway, and she hadn't noticed him yet. "She's got some spine to her." And the way she said it, private and to herself, had nothing but approval in it. He backed out of the doorway without making a sound. Christmas arrived without much announcement. Maeve acknowledged it by putting a bottle of good whiskey on the table at supper and allowing that they could consider work suspended for the following day. Dolph produced a tin of cookies his mother had sent with a supply rider 2 weeks prior. Cal, who had apparently been planning something, went out to the barn after supper and came back with a wooden horse he'd carved, painted badly, and tied a piece of red string around. He set it in front of Lena with the offhand aggression of someone who is embarrassed about having done something thoughtful. Lena looked at it. She looked at Cal. "You made this?" "Don't make a big thing of it." She held it carefully, turning it over in her hands. It was imperfect. One leg slightly longer than the other, the paint slapdash, the mane carved with more enthusiasm than skill. "I'm keeping it," she said. Cal went back to his food, but he was red around the ears for the next 20 minutes. Gideon, who had nothing to give anyone and had known for weeks that Christmas was coming and had still arrived at it empty-handed, sat with that feeling for a while. He wasn't a man who expressed much directly, but he had been raised with enough sense of occasion to know that having nothing to offer felt like a specific kind of failure. He looked around the table at these people he hadn't known 6 weeks ago and thought about what you give someone when you have nothing. After the meal, he went to the equipment shed and worked for 2 hours on something he'd been turning over in his head since mid-December. It was a bracing system for the barn door that had been sticking badly in the cold, something that should have been designed better when it was built, but hadn't been, and which Maeve's late husband had apparently addressed repeatedly with brute force and which kept unaddressing itself every winter. He rebuilt the hinge system from scratch with what he had available. It wasn't elegant, but it was correct. And when he tested it, the door moved smoothly on the first try, and he knew it would continue moving smoothly because he'd understood the actual problem instead of fighting the symptom. On Christmas morning, he told Maeve the barn door was done. She walked out and opened and closed it 3 times. She stood there with her hand on the handle. "How long has that door been bad?" she said. "I'm going to guess at least 4 winters." She was quiet for a moment. "He used to knock it back into place with his shoulder every morning," she said, like it was a living thing he could reason with. Gideon said nothing. He understood this wasn't a complaint about her husband. It was something more like affection, preserved in the particular way we remember someone's wrong approaches with fondness once they're gone. Maeve let go of the door. "Good," she said. "Thank you." She went back inside. He stood in the cold for a minute with his breath fogging and the door solid behind him and a feeling he didn't have a clean name for sitting in his chest. The new year brought temperatures that made December look like autumn. The thermometer on the porch read 11 below on the 2nd of January, and that was the warmest it got for 9 straight days. The water troughs froze solid every night despite the heating stones, requiring the process of breaking and repositioning every morning. 2 of the cattle showed signs of cold stress, and Maeve spent an entire afternoon in the barn monitoring them with a focused concern she wore like a different personality. Still quiet, still efficient, but with a tension in her jaw that Gideon had learned to read as worry. He worked beside her that afternoon without being asked. He did what she needed before she said it, the way you only can when you've spent enough time working alongside someone that you understand their physical logic. She needed the water warmed and he had it warmed. She needed the second animal's temperature checked and he had the thermometer. She moved and he moved around her, and they got through it, and both animals were stable by dark. Walking back to the house through the absolute zero of that evening, Maeve said, "You read the work well." "You make it readable," he said. She glanced at him sideways. That was all. But he'd gotten better at reading her register, and what was in that glance was something she didn't say often and didn't take back. Inside, Lena had put supper on. Beans, again, always beans, the frontier's most reliable food, and had done it correctly, which meant the fire was the right heat, and the bread wasn't burned, and she'd remembered without being told that Dolph took his coffee without anything in it. She was 11 years old and running a kitchen supper like a girl of 15, and it was only when Gideon sat down and saw her across the table and noticed how straight she was sitting, how capable she looked, that he felt something shift in a place behind his sternum. She wasn't the same child who had hidden under the canvas tarp in the wagon and said, "Dad?" in that small, uncertain voice. She wasn't grieving quietly anymore. She was here, present and sure-footed in a way she hadn't been since her mother died, maybe longer than that. He thought about what it had cost her, without his realizing, to be that quiet for so long. He thought about what had changed. Maeve sat down across from him and reached for the bread and didn't look at him, and he thought about what had changed, and he already knew the answer. The 15th of January was when the real trouble began, though they didn't know it yet. Gideon was replacing a section of fence on the western boundary when he found the tracks. He almost missed them. They were 2 days old, at least, half filled with new snow, crossing the property line from the Dunnick land to the east. Not animal tracks. Boot tracks. Someone had walked the fence line, not crossing it, just following it, stopping here and there, the impressions heavier and longer at those stopping points. Standing, reading the land, looking at the cattle in the pasture visible from the fence line. He walked the whole length and found 3 separate sets of these pauses. He didn't say anything that night. He wanted to be sure before he said anything, because Maeve was the kind of person who needed facts, not impressions, and he wasn't certain enough yet. But the next morning he went back to the western fence with fresh eyes and walked it again in the early light when the shadow angles were different, and this time he found something he'd missed. At one of the pause points, someone had dug briefly in the snow near the base of the fence post. Just a small disturbance, a few inches deep, the kind you'd make if you were checking how solid a post was, testing whether it could be pulled. He thought about the Dunnick land. He'd heard the name in passing. Dolph had mentioned it once with the specific neutrality people use for things they don't want to discuss openly. He hadn't asked. He probably should have. That evening after supper, when Dolph and Cal had gone to the bunk room and Lena was asleep, he told Maeve what he'd found. She listened with her hands flat on the table and her face still. When he was done, she was quiet for a long time. "How many pause points?" she said. 3 along the western stretch. Could be more further south. I only went to the corner." "Did you go to the corner post?" "No." She stood up and looked at the window as if she could see the western fence from here, which she couldn't. Her expression had gone somewhere he hadn't seen it go before. Inward and hard and not angry, exactly, but something adjacent to anger that was colder and more deliberate. "Raymond," she said. He waited. She turned around. Her voice was flat and controlled. "Raymond Holloway, my husband's brother. He's been after the western pasture for 3 years. It's the best grazing land on this side of the ridge. Evan, my husband, Evan refused to sell it or work it jointly. Then Evan died and Raymond decided that meant the terms had changed." She sat back down. "They haven't." Gideon said, "He's testing the fence posts. He's done it before. The county surveyor found inconsistencies in the original deed. Nothing that holds up. The inconsistencies were on Raymond's end, but Raymond has a lawyer in Millhaven who can write enough letters to make inconsistencies feel like facts." "Has he made a formal claim?" "Not yet, which is what the fence testing is about. He's looking for an opening, something physical to point to." She looked at Gideon. "If he can establish that my fence line isn't where I say it is, or that my posts aren't maintaining the boundary I claim, he can contest the boundary. He can make it expensive enough that contesting back becomes impractical. She said it the way someone says something they've rehearsed many times, which meant she'd had this conversation with herself many times, in the dark, when no one else was around to hear it. Raymond is patient. He knows what I don't have. Gideon thought about the next part carefully before he said it. You've been short-handed, he said. He knows that. He does. The western fence has been your weakest section. It has. It isn't anymore. She looked at him. I rebuilt 4 sections this month, he said. The posts are 18 inches deep and packed solid. If someone wants to argue about those posts, they're going to need to dig them up to make the argument, and what they'll find is they're exactly where they should be. Maeve was quiet for a moment. You didn't know about Raymond when you did that? No, but I knew weak fence was trouble regardless. She was looking at him with an expression that was hard to read in the lamplight. He had the sense, again, of something being added up, measured. Not cold, nothing in her was cold tonight, but deliberate, careful. There are still 4 sections to the south I haven't gotten to, he said. I'll get to them. She nodded. She was still looking at him. You should know about Raymond, she said, if he comes to the property. I'll know who he is. He won't come alone. He doesn't do anything alone. He brings the lawyer, or he brings a man from his ranch, or both. He's good at making himself seem official when he's not. Gideon said, I've met men like that. Most people haven't learned how to hold their ground with them. They say something that sounds reasonable, and you find yourself in the middle of an agreement you never intended. I've also met men like that, he said. Something happened in her expression. Not quite a smile. Maeve Holloway did not smile easily, he was learning, but a loosening around the eyes. A degree of tension that had been there all evening, releasing slightly. I believe you, she said. They sat at the table for another hour. She told him about Evan, not as a story, not with narrative or emotion, but in pieces, the way the barn door had come up on Christmas. Facts that unlocked other facts. He had run the ranch well for 11 years and died badly in his 12th, thrown from a horse during what should have been a routine push of cattle to the eastern pasture. The horse had stepped into a ground squirrel hole. Wrong foot, wrong angle, wrong day. Nothing dramatic, just physics and bad luck. The ranch had been his grandfather's before his father's before his. Maeve had come to it at 24 as a bride and had never left. She had no people within riding distance. Raymond was the only family, technically, and Raymond had decided that without Evan, she was an obstacle rather than a relation. She said this without self-pity, which made it harder to hear than if she'd said it with self-pity. Gideon said, He underestimated you. She looked up. 3 years, he said. He's been at this 3 years, and you're still here. Whatever he thought you were without Evan, you've been something else. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind had come up again, talking against the windows in the way it did on the coldest nights. Not howling, just present. A constant low pressure that you stopped hearing consciously after a while and started just feeling. I've been stubborn, she said finally. That's not a small thing, he said. Stubbornness is the thing between you and him having what he wants. She was quiet. Then, very simply, she said, I'm glad you found those tracks. So am I, he said. He meant something by it that was larger than the tracks. He thought she understood that. He thought, from the way she held his gaze for a second longer than necessary before looking at the table, that she understood it and wasn't ready to respond to it yet. And that was fine. He wasn't entirely ready to have said it. He went out to the barn room that night and lay on the cot and listened to the wind and thought about spring, the way he'd been told not to think about too many things too soon, and thought about it anyway. Raymond Holloway arrived on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of January, and he didn't come alone. Gideon was on the south fence when he heard the horses, 2 of them, coming up the main road at a pace that was deliberate rather than urgent, the kind of pace that announced itself on purpose. He straightened and looked toward the gate, and saw them come through it without stopping, without knocking, without any of the basic courtesies that a person extended when approaching another person's property. The gate was closed. They opened it and left it open behind them, which told him something about how they viewed the land they were riding onto. The man in front was built wide through the shoulders, running to heaviness now in his 50s, with a face that had been handsome once and had since gone in the direction of authority instead. the kind of face that had spent so many years expecting deference that it had forgotten how to look any other way. He rode a good horse, better than the working stock in Maeve's barn, and he wore his coat like a man who wanted you to notice it. The man behind him was thinner, younger, carrying a leather satchel across his saddle that Gideon recognized immediately for what it was: a lawyer's bag, full of paper that would be presented as though it meant something absolute. Gideon came down from the fence line and walked toward the house at an angle that would put him in the yard before they reached the porch. He didn't run. He didn't hurry in any visible way. But he arrived in the yard at the same moment Raymond Holloway reined his horse to a stop and looked down at him with the expression of a man who had expected the yard to be empty. "I need to speak with Mrs. Holloway," Raymond said. "She's inside," Gideon said. "I'll let her know you're here." Raymond's eyes moved over him with the slow assessment of a man who was accustomed to being able to place people quickly. He couldn't place Gideon. That bothered him in a way he didn't fully conceal. "And you are?" "Gideon Ashcroft. I work the ranch." "I wasn't aware Maeve had taken on new hands." "She has," Gideon said. He held the man's gaze without aggression and without apology, the way you hold a gate closed. Not fighting, just not moving. Raymond looked at the house. He looked back at Gideon. "Tell her Raymond is here. She'll want to come out." Gideon went inside. Maeve was already at the kitchen window. She'd seen them from there, he realized. Had probably seen them from the moment they turned up the road. Had probably been standing at that window since before they came through the gate. Her arms were crossed, and her face was the closed, hard version of itself, the one that didn't negotiate. "You heard?" he said. "I heard." "Do you want me in the yard or inside?" She looked at him. The question surprised her. Not the substance of it, but the fact that he'd asked it as though it were her decision entirely, which it was. "In the yard," she said. "Stand back. Don't speak unless he speaks to you first, all right? Don't let the lawyer get between you and the gate." He hadn't thought of that. He nodded. She put her coat on and went out the front door. He went out behind her. Raymond had dismounted by the time they came off the porch. He was holding his hat, which was the gesture of a man who knew when to appear respectful without actually feeling it. "Maeve," he said, "you're looking well." "Raymond?" She stopped 6 feet from him. "This isn't a social call. It doesn't have to be unfriendly. I know what you're here about. Say it plainly." Raymond glanced at Gideon, then back at Maeve with the expression of a man who preferred his conversations without witnesses. Since that wasn't on offer, he adjusted. "There are some questions about the western boundary," he said. "Mr. Calloway," he half turned to the man with the satchel, "has some documents I think you should look at. Survey documents. There are some irregularities." "There are no irregularities," Maeve said. "The original survey from 1887 was confirmed in 1903 and again in 1911. I have both documents." Raymond paused. A small recalibration happened behind his eyes. He hadn't expected her to be that specific. Gideon watched the lawyer, Calloway, whose expression had gone slightly neutral in the way of a professional who has just realized the opposing party is better prepared than anticipated. "Even so," Raymond said, "there's a question about the northeast corner post. The placement? The northeast corner post is 18 inches in the ground, packed solid, and sitting exactly where the 1911 survey says it should sit." Maeve's voice was level. "I had it checked and reset 3 weeks ago." Another pause, longer this time. Raymond looked at Gideon, not at Maeve. At Gideon, with an evaluating look that had shifted slightly in character, less dismissive, more calculating. "Your new hand has been busy," he said. "He works," Maeve said. "That's what ranch hands do." Raymond put his hat back on, which meant the respectful portion of the visit was over. "Maeve." His voice dropped into something lower and more intimate, the tone of a man reaching for family connection like a tool. Evan would have wanted... "Don't," she said. The word landed like something physical. Raymond stopped. "Don't put words in his mouth," she said. "Evan is gone. This ranch is mine. The boundary is where it's always been. If Mr. Calloway has documents he believes are relevant, he can send copies to the county recorder's office, and they can compare them with what I have on file. That's the process. That's the only process I'm interested in. She looked at Raymond directly. If you come through my gate again without an invitation, I'll have you removed. Do you understand me? Raymond was quiet for a moment. His face had gone through several versions of itself in the last few minutes, confident, recalibrating, reaching, and now settling into something harder and colder, which was probably his truest face. You're going to run this place into the ground, he said. You know that. Evan knew how to work it. You've been… Go home, Raymond. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Gideon one more time, and the look was specific. It was the look of a man storing information for later use, cataloging a new variable in a calculation he hadn't finished making. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and rode back toward the gate. Calloway followed without having opened his satchel. They went through the gate, and Gideon watched them until they reached the road and turned east and were gone from sight. Beside him, Maeve let out a breath. Not dramatic, barely audible, but the first real breath she'd taken since coming outside. Her arms, which had been crossed since Raymond dismounted, dropped to her sides. The 1903 and 1911 documents, Gideon said. Do you actually have both of them? A pause. I have the 1911 one. He looked at her. The 1903 one I've been trying to locate for 2 years, she said. It's in the county recorder's office. Or it was. The recorder before the current one had a system that was… She made a short, tired gesture with her hand. Charitable to call it a system. So you bluffed him. I stated what should be true, she said, which is almost the same thing. She turned and walked back to the house. Find the rest of that south fence today if you can. He watched her go. He thought about the look Raymond had given him before riding out, that particular cataloging look, and he thought about what came next, because a man like Raymond Holloway didn't ride away from a conversation like that and decide he was done. He went back to the south fence. Lena knew something had happened. She was too perceptive not to. She'd developed over the last months a fine-tuned sense for the texture of the ranch's atmosphere. The way a child who has lived through instability learns to read rooms before entering them. She found Gideon at supper more quiet than usual, and Maeve in a specific kind of controlled stillness that Lena had started to recognize as the version of herself Maeve deployed when something was worrying her and she'd decided not to show it. Lena looked between them once, assessed, and said nothing about it. She talked to Cal about whether the spotted mare was getting better or worse on her back left leg, and the conversation was ordinary and ran through supper like a current that kept everything moving on the surface. After, she found her father in the barn checking on the mule, which was not something that required checking on at 9 in the evening. Who came today? She said. He looked at her. He considered the various versions of, it's nothing, and don't worry about it, and discarded all of them, because Lena had an unerring sense for exactly those kinds of dismissals, and responded to them by quietly adding them to a ledger he couldn't see. And what happened to the information in that ledger, he wasn't entirely sure. Maeve's brother-in-law, he said. He's got a claim on some of the land. We handled it. Is he going to come back? Probably. Lena was quiet, stroking the mule's nose in the absent-minded way she'd picked up from Maeve, who did the same thing when she was thinking. She's not going to lose the ranch, Lena said. It was not quite a question. No, he said. She's not. Lena looked at him. You sound sure. I am. She considered him for a moment with that particular attention that occasionally made him feel she could see things about him he hadn't identified himself. Okay, she said finally, and went back to the house. He stood with the mule for a while after she left, his hand on the animal's neck, listening to the barn sounds, the horses shifting, the wind on the roof, the distant creak of the door he'd fixed on Christmas morning. He thought about Raymond's last look. He thought about Maeve saying, I'll have you removed with the absolute steadiness of someone who meant it, and he thought about what removed meant in practice, out here, with only himself and Dolph and Cal between her and whatever Raymond decided to try next. He didn't sleep well that night, but he slept. 12 days later, the blizzard began. It didn't announce itself the way the December storms had. Those had come with dropping pressure and shifting winds and enough warning to prepare. This one dropped out of the northwest in the early hours of a Thursday morning with a sudden violence that woke Gideon from a dead sleep. Not a sound exactly, but a pressure change, something in the air that his body understood before his mind did. He was on his feet and pulling his boots on before he was fully awake. He opened the barn door and the wind took it from him and slammed it back against the frame with a crack that startled the horses into noise. The snow was horizontal. The distance between the barn and the house, 40 feet of open yard he walked 10 times a day, had become an event. He could see the house lights. Maeve was already up. And he could not see the fence line beyond the yard, which was 20 feet further. He got the barn door secured and went to the house. Maeve was at the barometer. The needle was lower than he'd seen it. She tapped the glass once and said without turning, "Cal and Dolph are up on the north ridge. They went up yesterday to check the line shack and the snowpack on the upper pasture." Gideon went still. The north ridge was 3 miles up a trail that became barely navigable in good conditions and became something else entirely in conditions like this. The line shack was a one-room structure built for emergency shelter, and it was stocked, and it was solid. That was the good news. The bad news was 3 miles of trail between the shack and the barn in a whiteout with temperatures he guessed were already below zero and dropping. "They know the trail," he said. It was not quite reassurance. It was a fact being laid on the table to see how much weight it carried. "Dolph knows it," Maeve said. "Cal's been up there twice, in summer." She was already moving, coat off its hook, scarf, the heavy gloves she kept on the shelf above the door. "The shack has a stove. They have fuel. They have enough food for 4 days. "This won't last 4 days." "No, but it could last 2. She was looking at him now, and in her eyes was the thing she hadn't said yet. 2 days in the line shack was survivable if the stove stayed lit and the fuel held. What it wasn't survivable was if the stove went wrong, or the fuel ran short, or if Cal, 17, twice up this trail in summer, made a bad decision and tried to come down on his own. "I'm going up," Gideon said. Maeve said, "I know." And then, "So am I." He opened his mouth. She said, "Don't." "Maeve, I have been on that trail in every condition it can produce. I know where it goes sideways. I know the ice crossings, and I know which ones hold and which ones don't by time of year and temperature." She held his gaze. "You're better than most men I've seen in bad weather. You are not better than me on that ridge. We go together, or neither of us goes fast enough." He looked at her for a long moment. "Together," he said. "What?" Lena was awake by the time they'd assembled what they needed. She came down the stairs in her 2 coats already on, her hat pulled low, and she looked at them. The ropes, the extra fuel canisters, the medical kit Maeve was packing with brisk efficiency, and she read all of it without being told. "I'm staying with the animals," she said. Gideon said, "Lena, the horses need checking every 2 hours in this. The water troughs will freeze no matter what. The cattle in the south pen need someone." She was looking at him with an expression that was not a child asking permission. It was a person stating what she was going to do. "I know the barn. I know all of it." He looked at Maeve. Maeve said to Lena, "Biscuit stays with you. Keep the barn door chained when you're inside, not locked. You need to be able to get out fast if you have to. Don't go further than the barn, not for any reason." "I know," Lena said. "If we're not back by—" Maeve looked at the clock. 4 o'clock. You don't come looking. You stay and you wait." Lena held her gaze. "Come back before 4 o'clock, she said. Maeve put her hand briefly on Lena's shoulder. Quick, firm, the way you grip something important before you have to let it go. And then picked up her pack and went to the door. Gideon stopped in front of his daughter. He looked at her face under the pulled-down hat. She looked back at him steadily. 4 o'clock, he said. "I'll have something hot when you get back," she said. "All 4 of you." He pulled her in and held her for 3 seconds, the way a person holds someone when they're making themselves stop and actually feel the moment instead of just moving through it. Then he let go and followed Maeve out into the storm. The wind hit them like a wall and kept being a wall. It didn't gust. It simply applied itself constantly from the northwest, with a systematic indifference to what was in its way. The snow it carried wasn't the heavy, wet kind that stacked up and slowed you down. It was fine and hard and driven fast enough to find every gap in clothing and score the exposed parts of a face like fine sandpaper. Maeve went first on the trail. This was not a gesture of bravado. It was practical, because she could read the trail's shape under the snow, where to him it was simply a white surface that might continue or might not. She walked with her body slightly forward, feeling with her lead foot before committing weight, and he followed her footprints with 2 seconds of spacing between them so that if the ground changed under her, he wasn't already committed to the same step. He'd done mountain work before, logging country, years back, before Lena was born. He'd worked a winter cutting job in terrain not unlike this, and he'd learned things that came back to him now, muscle memory and instinct firing in sequence. Keep your weight centered. Don't fight the wind, angle into it. Watch for the places where the snow surface changes texture, because texture change means the substrate has changed and what's under you has changed. Maeve moved with a knowledge of this specific ground that was different from technique. She knew where the trail bent without seeing the bend. She knew where a rock face blocked the wind and gave them a few seconds of relative stillness to adjust and look ahead. She knew, 50 yards before they reached it, that there was an ice crossing ahead because she told him. 30 yards, she said, turning her head back just enough to be heard. Creek crossing. Plank bridge, but there's ice over the planks. I'll go first and test it. If it holds, come across one at a time. Stay to the right. The left side of the bridge had soft support last fall. How often do you come up here in winter? Used to be every 2 weeks with Evan. A beat. Haven't been up since November. He wanted to ask more, but this was not the time. They reached the crossing and he stopped and watched her go across. Carefully, her weight distributed, testing each step, staying right. And she reached the other side and turned and nodded. He crossed. The planks held. The left side had a flex in it that the right side didn't, and he was glad she'd told him. 3 inches either way, and he might have tested it without thinking. They went up. The lined shack appeared through the storm as a darker shape against the white, a right angle where there should be no right angles, and Gideon felt his chest loosen with a relief he hadn't fully acknowledged he was holding. Smoke was coming from the chimney. Not much smoke, thinner than he'd like, but smoke. Maeve reached the door first and knocked twice and opened it without waiting, because the people inside were not in a position to be formal about it. The shack was 1 room, maybe 12 by 14, and it was significantly colder than it should have been. The stove was burning, but barely. The fuel supply, which should have been adequate, had a problem he saw immediately. The stack vent had partially blocked, which was pushing smoke back into the room intermittently and causing the fire to run low because whoever had been tending it had been managing it small to keep from filling the room with smoke. Cal was on the bunk in the corner, awake, pale-faced, with a coat over him that was not adequate. Dolph was at the stove, which was where Dolph would be. The older man had made himself into the problem's solution, keeping the fire going and keeping Cal warm and not panicking, which was exactly what you'd want from Dolph in an emergency and exactly what he delivered. He looked up when they came in and said, "Vents blocked," with the same tone he used to report that a fence post needed replacing. "I can see that," Maeve said. She was already looking at the stove assembly. "How long?" "Maybe 6 hours. Started going wrong around midnight. Cal got some smoke in him before I figured out what was wrong." Cal, from the bunk, said, "I'm fine," in a voice that was slightly too thin to be convincing. Maeve looked at him with a practiced eye, assessing, not sympathetic, because sympathy wasn't what was needed right now. "Did you eat this morning?" "Yes." "All of it?" A pause. "Most." "Dolph, get him the rest of what you have. He needs fuel to stay warm." She turned to Gideon. "I need you on the roof. The vent cap has either iced over or shifted. I need it cleared." He looked at the ceiling, then at the stove chimney, then at the general idea of being on a roof in the current conditions. "Tell me what I'm looking for." "Cap is cast iron, 4-sided, sits on a collar. If it's iced over, you can break it loose. I have a mallet in the pack. If it's shifted, it rotates on the collar and you turn it back. Either way, you'll know when the draw improves because you'll hear the stove change." "How will I know I'm not about to go off the roof?" "There's a ridge rope, should still be tied to the east corner beam. Find it before you go more than 2 feet from the peak." She met his eyes. "Don't be brave. Be careful." "Those are occasionally the same thing," he said. "Not on a roof in a blizzard." He went back out into the storm. The roof was lower pitched than it looked from the ground, which was either good or bad depending on what happened next. He got up from the east side using the wall for handholds in the log construction, found the ridge rope, stiff with ice but intact, and clipped it through his belt the way he'd seen mountain men rig themselves on steep work. He moved toward the chimney on his knees because standing was not a realistic option. The vent cap was iced, not shifted, frozen solid on the collar, with a quarter-inch crust of ice bonded to the underside of the cap's flange. He felt around it with his fingers through the heavy gloves and found the extent of it and drew the mallet from inside his coat where he'd carried it against his body to keep the metal from becoming dangerously cold. He worked carefully. The instinct was to hit hard and break the ice all at once, but that risked cracking the cast-iron collar, and a cracked collar was worse than a blocked vent because you couldn't fix a cracked collar with anything they had on hand. He hit the ice on the cap's rim in short, angled strokes, fracturing the crust in sections, working around the circumference. The wind tried to take the mallet twice. He shortened his swing and held tighter. On the seventh stroke, the cap shifted. Just slightly, a quarter-inch rotation, but the ice had broken enough to allow movement. He worked it back and forth until it rotated freely on the collar, repositioned it correctly, and felt around the seal with his fingers until he was satisfied it was seated. He didn't hear the stove change from up here, but after 2 minutes, the smoke coming from the vent shifted from thin and irregular to steady and dark, the good strong draw of a fire being properly fed air. He got off the roof the way he'd gotten on it, carefully, in sections, checking each hand and foothold, and came in the door with ice in his eyebrows and his hands numb through the gloves. Maeve looked at the stove, then at him. The fire inside was visibly stronger. "It was iced," he said. "I know." She was already wrapping his hands in the spare cloth she'd pulled from the pack, the pragmatic medical gesture he'd seen before, pressing warmth in with her own hands through the cloth. "How bad are they?" "Numb. Not gone." "Feel this?" She pressed firmly. "Yes." "Good." She kept the pressure going for a minute without speaking. The shack was already warming, faster than expected, which meant the stove had been performing well until the vent failed and would perform well again now. Cal was sitting up straighter. Dolph had more color than when they'd come in. Gideon looked down at Maeve's hands around his and thought about the barn room, the cot, the night he'd sat with his back to the wall and thought about spring. He thought about Raymond Holloway's cataloging look, and about Lena saying, "Come back before 4 o'clock" without her voice changing, and about the ice cap and the mallet and the number of strokes it took to break something loose when you couldn't afford to crack it. Maeve looked up and caught him looking at her. She didn't look away. He didn't either. "Thank you," she said. Just that. "We're not down yet," he said. "No." She released his hands and stood. "But we will be." She said it the same way she'd said everything since the moment he'd arrived at her gate in the snow, not as hope, not as reassurance, but as simple assessment. "We will be down. It is a fact I am declaring in advance and intend to make true." He believed her. The descent took longer than the ascent because they were moving 4 people instead of 2, and Cal needed a pace set to his condition. Not slow, because slow in the cold was its own danger, but measured. Dolph went last with Cal between himself and Maeve, and Gideon went first now, following the tracks they'd made coming up before the wind had time to finish erasing them, finding the trail by the packed character of the snow under it, and the memory of the route still live in his legs. The creek crossing Gideon took last this time, watching the others go, and when he stepped on the bridge, he felt the left side shift slightly under his weight. Not catastrophically, not yet, but differently than it had 2 hours ago, the cold and the traffic across it having worked on whatever the soft support was hiding. He got across in 4 quick steps and didn't look back at it. On the way down through the creek bed section, Maeve caught up to him and walked beside him for a stretch where the trail was wide enough. "The bridge," she said quietly, "needs work. In the spring. Before spring if the temperature swings." She nodded. She was looking at the trail ahead with the same expression she used for the barometer, reading, calculating, adding up what she'd learned against what was coming. "It's been on my list," she said. "Everything's been on my list." He said, "The list is getting shorter." She glanced at him. Not the cataloging look. Something else. something that acknowledged what he'd said and what was behind it and chose not to deflect it. "It is," she said. And then the trail narrowed and she dropped back, and they didn't talk again until the ranch lights appeared below them through the curtain of snow, amber and steady and real. Lena had the barn lights on, the yard light, the kitchen light, every light the ranch had burning as beacons against the storm, which was exactly what they were. And when Gideon saw them from 300 yards up the trail, he felt something move in him that he didn't try to name right away. They came through the gate, all 4 of them, at 20 minutes before 4 o'clock. Lena opened the door and looked out, and the expression on her face when she counted them, 1, 2, 3, 4, was a thing he would remember for the rest of his life. She didn't run out. She stood in the doorway in her 2 coats with the kitchen light behind her and said, with perfect steadiness that cost her visibly, "I told you I'd have something hot." Cal went inside first because he was the coldest, and Dolph followed, and Maeve paused at the door and looked at Lena and said quietly, "You kept all the animals?" "All of them," Lena said. "Even the spotted mare. She was restless. I sat with her." Maeve held her gaze for a moment. "Good," she said. The word in Maeve's register was not faint praise. It was what she gave instead of embraces. Gideon was the last inside. He stopped beside his daughter and put his hand briefly on her hat-covered head, the way he'd done when she was small and when she wasn't, and both of them pretended otherwise. She leaned into it for exactly 1 second. Then she went to check on the soup. The soup was bean and salt pork, and it was not remarkable, but Cal ate 2 bowls of it sitting wrapped in every spare blanket Lena could find. And by the second bowl his color had come back enough that Dolph stopped watching him with the quiet, steady attention of a man monitoring a situation that might still go wrong. Nobody talked much that first hour. The storm was still pressing against the house, the windows dark with it, and the fire was high, and they all sat with the accumulated weight of the last several hours settling through them in the particular way that physical danger settles once you're on the other side of it. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in stages, the body slowly releasing what it had been holding. Gideon sat with his hands wrapped around a mug and felt the numbness in his fingers resolve itself into something painful, which was the correct direction. He flexed them slowly, one at a time. Across the table, Maeve was doing the same thing, though she was doing it under the table where it was less visible, which was so entirely consistent with her that he almost said something about it and then didn't. Lena moved through the kitchen with a focused quiet, refilling what needed refilling, putting the spare blankets back when they were no longer needed, washing the bowls as they came available. She was not performing helpfulness. She was just helping, the way she'd learned here, finding the next needed thing without being directed toward it. Somewhere in the second hour, the storm began to ease. Not end, it would take another day to blow itself out, but the quality of it changed, the wind cycling down from its sustained assault to something intermittent, and the windows showed gray rather than black, which meant the moon was up behind the clouds somewhere. Dolph took Cal to the bunk room. Cal went without argument, which told everyone how tired he actually was, since Cal normally had an argument available for most situations. Then it was just Gideon and Maeve and Lena in the kitchen, and Lena looked at her father and said, "I'm going to bed," in a tone that was not actually a statement about sleep, so much as it was a deliberate opening of space, which at 11 years old was a level of social perception that he found both impressive and occasionally unnerving. She went upstairs. Maeve got up and added a log to the fire. She stood at the stove with her back to him for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something." "All right." She turned around and leaned against the stove frame, and her expression was the one he'd seen a handful of times. Not closed, not performing composure, just unguarded in a way she didn't often permit herself. "When you went up on that roof," she said, "I stood at the door for the first 10 minutes listening for a sound that meant something had gone wrong." He said nothing. "I've lost enough people," she said. "I've gotten efficient at not thinking about it in the moment because thinking about it in the moment doesn't help anything. But I was listening." He turned the mug in his hands. "I came back," he said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I'm saying it mattered that you did." He looked at her across the kitchen, and the distance between them felt both ordinary and very significant, and he thought about all the things that had accumulated between November and now. The bean portions, and the barn door, and the barometer, and the way she'd said together when he'd asked how they should go up the ridge, and he thought that there was a threshold that had been approached slowly for months, and that they were standing at it now, on the same side of it finally. He said, "Maeve." "Yes." "When the past clears—" "Don't," she said. Not the same don't she'd used with Raymond. This one was quieter and cost her something. "Don't tell me now. It's been a long day. We're both—" She made a brief, honest gesture. "Not quite ourselves right now." He thought about it. She was right, which he appreciated even though he wished she weren't. Decisions made in the aftermath of hard things tended to carry the weight of the hard thing rather than their own weight, and he'd learned enough about himself to know that he couldn't always tell the difference in the moment. "Tomorrow, then," he said. She held his gaze. "Tomorrow," she said, and went to bed. He sat at the table for another half hour listening to the storm diminish, and when he finally went out to the barn room, the sky between the pines had one clear edge of stars, the storm breaking from the south, and the air had the specific quality of cold that follows the worst of it, sharp and clean and very still. Morning brought a transformed ranch. The snow had come down 3 feet in places, drifted to 5 and 6 against the barn and the north fence, and had settled flat and blinding white across the pasture where it had nothing to drift against. The sky was the pale, hard blue of winter clearing, and the sun on the snow was fierce enough to squint against. There was no question of having the conversation that morning. The rescue had become news overnight. Gideon didn't know how exactly, since none of them had ridden out, but by mid-morning a man named Hooper from the neighboring Callahan spread to the west was at the gate, having apparently been told by someone that there had been men stranded on the North Ridge and that Black Ridge Ranch had brought them down. Hooper wanted to know if everyone was accounted for. He also, transparently, wanted to see for himself because news of that kind didn't travel in ranch country without carrying extra weight. Gideon met him at the gate and told him everyone was fine. Hooper looked at him with the assessing look that men in small communities use on newcomers when the newcomer has done something that demands an opinion. "You went up the ridge in that?" Hooper said. He said it without obvious judgment, more like a man checking a reported fact against observed reality. "Maeve and I both went," Gideon said. "In that," Hooper said again, apparently needing to process this. "The boys were in the line shack, stove vent blocked. We fixed it and came down." Hooper looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the ranch, the barn, the yard, the house, with the slow reading look of a man revising something. "I'll tell the Callahans," he said. They were worried. He gathered his reins. "You got things in hand here." It was not a question. Gideon said, "We do," and meant it. 3 more riders came by that day. Not Raymond. Raymond was not the kind of man who came to inquire after other people's welfare, but neighbors from up and down the Ridge Road, people Gideon had heard mentioned but not met, stopping to check, to offer help if needed, to register that they knew what had happened. Maeve received each of them at the door with the contained hospitality of a woman who was not accustomed to being the subject of concern and found it slightly awkward and was handling it with dignity anyway. By the 4th visitor, Cal was up and feeling sufficient to be embarrassed about the fuss, which Gideon counted as full recovery. That evening, after supper, Dolph said something unprecedented. Dolph, who in 4 months had averaged perhaps a dozen voluntary remarks per day, set down his coffee and said, to no one in particular, and therefore to everyone, "I've worked 3 ranches before this one. This is the best run one I've been on." He picked up his coffee again. Thought it ought to be said. Nobody knew quite how to respond to this. Cal stared at his bowl. Lena looked at Maeve. Maeve said, "Thank you, Dolph," simply, without deflecting it. He nodded and finished his coffee and went to bed. Gideon looked at Maeve across the table and she looked back at him, and they did not say anything, but something in the exchange acknowledged what was accumulating between them. Then she started clearing the table, and he helped, and it was ordinary, and the ordinary of it was its own kind of statement. Bots. He found her the next morning in the equipment shed, going through the supply inventory with a pencil and a weathered notebook. This was a regular practice of hers. She kept the inventory obsessively, updating after every storm, cross-checking against what had been used and what had been planned. He knew the notebook. He'd watched her with it. He came in and closed the shed door, and she looked up. The pass, he said. What's your honest read? When does it clear? She set the pencil down. March, realistically. Maybe late March if this storm damaged the snowpack the way I think it did. Could push to April. That's 6 to 8 weeks? Yes. He looked at her directly. I want to talk about what comes after that. She was quiet. She didn't look away and she didn't make it easier for him, which was consistent. I have a promise to keep, he said. The letter, Dunmore. Lena's mother's family. I meant it when I accepted it, and I still mean it. He paused. But I've been thinking about what keeping it means, whether it means going and not coming back, or whether it means going and coming back. Maeve was very still. I'd like it to mean coming back, he said, if that's something you'd have. The shed was quiet. Outside, somewhere over the barn, a gust moved through the pines and was gone. She said, You're asking me something. I am. Say it plainly. He didn't look away from her. I'm asking if this is somewhere I can come back to. If you want that. Not as a hand. I know you need a hand. That's not what I'm asking about. I'm asking about something else. She looked at him for a long time. He had the sense of something very careful happening behind her eyes. Not reluctance. More like someone checking the ground before committing weight. Doing it honestly, refusing to move before the check was done. Evan's been gone 4 years, she said. Her voice was level, but it was taking something to make it level. I stopped expecting to want something like this again. I told myself I was content with that. I was mostly even right about it. A pause. And then you came through my gate with a broken wagon and a cold child and asked nothing except to work for what you needed. And it complicated the picture. She looked at the notebook on the shelf rather than at him. You're not Evan. No. You're not trying to be. No, he said. I'm not. She looked back at him. I know what I'd be taking on, she said. You and Lena, and whatever that means for this ranch, for Lena growing up here, for... She stopped and started again. It's not a simple thing. I know that. I'm not easy to live with. I've noticed, he said, and then, because it needed saying, neither am I. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile. Close to one, the closest he'd seen. No, she said quietly. You're not. She was quiet for another moment. Then she said, Ask me again when the pass is clear. He looked at her. Why then? Because then you'll have had time to be sure. You'll have gone through the winter all the way to the end, and you'll know what this is and what it isn't, and when you ask me in the spring, I'll know the answer you give me isn't cold and close quarters and gratitude. She met his eyes steadily. Ask me then. He thought about arguing with this. He had things he could say, that he didn't need a season of confirmation, that he already knew what the winter had shown him. But he looked at her and understood that this wasn't doubt about him. It was caution applied honestly to both of them, the way she applied caution to everything that mattered. Not from fear of the answer, but from respect for what the question deserved. All right, he said. She picked up her pencil. The fuel supply is going to need topping before February's out, she said. I'll need you to take the wagon to Millhaven. When? 2 weeks, when the road's passable again. He nodded and went back to work. February arrived and settled in with a gray, exhausted quality, the kind of cold that wasn't dramatic anymore. It was simply the condition of everything, unceasing and taken for granted. The worst of the winter had passed through, and what remained was the long tail of it, the weeks when the snow didn't add dramatically to what was already there, but simply stayed, and the work was maintenance rather than crisis. Raymond came back on a Wednesday in the first week of February. This time he came alone, without Calloway and the lawyer's satchel, and he came not to the gate, but to the west fence line, which Gideon found out because Lena saw him from the barn door and came to tell him without running, walking quickly and directly, with the focused economy of someone who understood that urgency and panic were different things. Western fence, she said, the section near the old tree. He's on his horse, just standing there. Gideon looked at her. How long? Maybe 10 minutes before I came to find you. He hasn't touched anything. He went to the western fence. Raymond was there, exactly as Lena had described. Not at the fence, not touching it, simply sitting his horse 15 feet back from it on his own land looking. He looked at Gideon when Gideon appeared on the other side. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Raymond said, "I heard about the ridge." Gideon said nothing. "Two men stranded. You and Maeve went up in the blizzard and brought them down." Raymond's voice had the flat quality of someone delivering information they find inconvenient. "People are talking about it." "People can talk about whatever they want," Gideon said. Raymond looked at him with the assessing look again, the one from his first visit that had stored information for later. He'd had a month to process whatever he'd stored. "You're not just a ranch hand," he said. It was not an accusation and not a compliment. It was the revised verdict of a man updating his calculation. "I work the ranch," Gideon said. "That's not what I said." Gideon held the man's gaze across the fence. The post between them was solid and deep and correctly placed, and Raymond knew it. "Is there something you need, Mr. Holloway?" Raymond looked at the fence. He looked at the land beyond it, the pasture that was his actual interest, dormant now under snow. He looked at Gideon. "Evan built this place," he said, and the way he said it had something raw in it. Not grief. Raymond didn't seem like a man who grieved, but something that had been frustration for so long it had changed shape. "I knew this land before Maeve did. I grew up on the neighboring property. I watched my brother build this. When he died," he stopped. "I thought it would fall apart. I thought she'd need help." "She didn't need the kind of help you were offering," Gideon said. A silence. "No," Raymond said, with the difficulty of a man conceding something he'd spent years avoiding. "I handled it wrong." He looked out at the pasture again. "That doesn't mean I was wrong about all of it. She's been carrying this alone. It's too much for one person." "She's not carrying it alone," Gideon said. She hasn't been for a while." Raymond looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the fence. The repaired sections, the solid posts, the clean line of it running north and south with no ambiguity about where it was. "No," he said slowly. "I can see that." He gathered his reins. He was quiet for a moment before he turned his horse. "Tell her," he started and stopped, and seemed to decide something. "Tell her I'll withdraw the filing with the county recorder. There's nothing there. There never was." Gideon watched him ride east. He stood at the fence for a while after Raymond was gone, looking at the land on both sides of it, thinking about what had just happened and what it meant. Raymond was not a reformed man. He understood that. A man like Raymond didn't have one conversation at a fence line and change his nature. But something had shifted, and shifted genuinely, and he'd said what he'd said without the lawyer present, without witnesses except Gideon, which meant it wasn't performance. He told Maeve that evening. She listened with her hands in her lap and her face composed. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He said he'd withdraw it. "Yes, that's—" She stopped. He could see her calibrating how much to believe it, running it against everything she knew about Raymond, which was more than Gideon knew. "I'll believe it when it's done," she said finally. "But I'll—" "Yes." She looked at the table. "That's something." He didn't push it further. He understood that she'd spent 3 years building defenses against a specific threat, and that defenses didn't dismantle the moment the threat changed character. They came down slowly, with evidence. And Lena turned 12 in the 3rd week of February. Nobody had made a plan about it, which was Gideon's failure, and he knew it. He'd been watching the date approach and telling himself he'd figure something out, and had reached the day still figuring. He said something to Maeve about it the morning before, working up to a kind of confession, and Maeve looked at him with an expression that said she had already known and had already handled it. What she had done, she'd written, 2 weeks prior, to the supply rider who came through on the Mill Haven route, and asked him to bring back a specific item from the dry goods store. The item arrived the day before Lena's birthday, wrapped in cloth and paper. It was a pair of good riding gloves, not children's gloves, not small ones, proper working gloves in Lena's size, fitted, with reinforced palms. The kind a woman who worked horses wore. She put them on the table at breakfast without ceremony. Lena unwrapped them and went still. She looked at the gloves. She looked at Maeve. "These are real ones," she said. "You ride like someone who should have real ones," Maeve said. Lena put them on. They fit. She looked at her hands in them with the expression of someone who has been handed something that changes a self-perception in a very specific way. The kind of gift that is also a statement about who the giver sees you as. She looked up at Maeve and said, "Thank you," and meant it with the full weight of the words. Maeve said, "Don't lose them," and went to check on the cattle. Gideon watched his daughter sit at the table with her gloved hands flat on the surface, looking at them. He thought about what it meant to a child to be seen accurately by someone who was sparing with their seeing. He thought about what Maeve had done and what it had cost her, which was not money. The gloves were not expensive, but something more internal, the act of claiming care for a child who wasn't hers. Cal appeared in the doorway and said, "You gonna wear those all day?" Lena said yes. He sat down across from her and looked at the gloves. "They're nice," he said, with the constrained admiration of someone who wasn't going to make a big thing of it. "Maeve got them," Lena said. "I know," Cal said. "She asked me what size." He looked away. "I guessed." Lena stared at him. "You guessed my hand size." "It wasn't. I looked at your hand when you weren't." He stopped. He was going red again. "They fit, don't they?" Lena looked at the gloves and looked at Cal. "They fit perfectly," she said. Cal picked up his coffee and said nothing further for 10 minutes, which was as close to dignity as the situation allowed. In the first week of March, a letter came from Dunmore. It came with the supply rider, addressed in handwriting Gideon didn't recognize at first, and then did, with a jolt, because the handwriting was similar enough to his wife's to stop his breath for a moment before his eyes caught the name at the bottom. Margaret Foss, Clara's cousin. He'd written to her in December, a brief letter, telling her he'd been delayed and would be through in the spring. He'd kept the letter factual. He hadn't known what else to say. Her response was 3 pages long, which surprised him. She was not the way he'd expected from 3 sentences. She wrote with a warmth and a directness that came through clearly, asking about Lena, asking about the ranch and the people who'd taken them in, asking whether spring meant April or later. She said they hadn't given up hope of meeting Lena, that Clara had talked about a child in her life, but that they'd had so little time, that if they could meet Gideon and Lena, it would mean something to them. He read it twice at the kitchen table that morning. Maeve came in, saw him, saw the letter. She went to the stove and started the coffee without asking. After a moment, she said, "Dunmore?" "Clara's cousin, Margaret." He set the letter down. "She wants to meet Lena." Maeve poured the coffee. She brought his mug to the table and sat down across from him, and she didn't fill the silence with anything, which was exactly right. "She writes well," he said, which was not what he was actually saying. "What does she want?" "To know Lena, to..." Clara apparently talked about having a child and never quite did, and Lena is... He stopped. "She's the closest thing to that." Maeve said, "That's good then." He looked at her. She was looking at the mug in her hands, and her expression was the careful, unreadable one, the one that cost her more than it appeared to. "It is good," he said. "It's a good reason to keep the promise." She looked up. "You were always going to keep it." "Yes." They looked at each other across the table. Outside, the eve was dripping for the first time since December. Not a thaw, not quite, but the particular drip that happened in early March when the sun angle finally changed enough to find the south-facing roof edges. The sound of it was small and intermittent, and it changed the quality of the morning in a way both of them heard without remarking on it. "The pass," she said. "I'll know better in 2 weeks. But I think..." She looked at the window. "I think it'll be late March. Maybe April 1st safely." He nodded. She said, "You should write back to her. Tell her when to expect you." He looked at her. "Tell her when to expect us." A pause. Maeve looked at him with the careful, weight-testing look. "That's not settled," she said quietly. "I know, I said I'd ask you when the pass was clear." He held her gaze. "The pass is nearly clear. I'm giving you notice." Something moved across her face. Not quite what he expected. Something more complicated. Complicated in the way of a person who has constructed a life around not needing, being confronted with wanting, and discovering those two things don't dismantle each other as neatly as she'd thought. "Give me until it's actually clear," she said. He nodded. That was fair. He picked up the letter and read Margaret Foss's 3 pages a third time, and the kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and the sound of the eave dripping. And somewhere out in the barn, Lena was doing her morning rounds in her birthday gloves. And the ranch existed around all of it, solid and ongoing, the way it had been for decades and intended to go on being. He thought about Raymond at the fence saying she's not alone anymore. He thought Raymond had been right, for the wrong reasons first, and then slowly for the right ones. He folded the letter and put it in his coat pocket, next to the photograph of Clara, next to the original 3-sentence invitation that had started all of this, and he went out to help with the morning work. The pass cleared on the 28th of March. Gideon knew because Maeve told him at breakfast, setting his coffee down and saying, without preamble, "Hooper's man came through this morning, said the East Road is open to the junction." She sat down. She didn't look at him right away. She looked at her coffee. "That's the pass." He said, "I know." She looked up then. They held each other's gaze across the table for a moment, and everything that had been accumulating since the equipment shed conversation in February was present in that look. Not tension exactly, but the specific weight of something that had been held carefully for a long time and was now being set down to see what shape it had. Lena was outside with Cal checking the spotted mare, who had developed a minor thrush on her front right hoof that required daily attention. The kitchen was quiet. The eave had been dripping steadily for 2 weeks now, and the snow in the yard had receded enough to show the mud beneath it, the dark earth coming back to itself. Gideon said, "I told you I'd ask when the pass was clear." "You did," Maeve said. "The pass is clear." She wrapped both hands around her mug. He'd learned to read that gesture. It was what she did when she was about to say something that cost her, bracing without appearing to brace. "Before you ask," she said, "I want to say something." He waited. "I've been alone on this ranch for 4 years," she said. "Not just without Evan. Alone in the way where you stop expecting things. You stop expecting company, and you stop expecting help, and you stop expecting—" She paused and started again without looking for a better word. "Anything that isn't work. You rebuild yourself around what's manageable. And that works. It's a functional way to live." She looked at him. "And then you came through the gate and it stopped working, and I resented that for a while before I understood what was actually happening." He said nothing. He was watching her the way she sometimes watched the barometer, shamasm, closely, not wanting to interrupt what the instrument was telling him. "What was happening," she said, "is that I was getting proof that what I'd told myself was manageable was actually just less than what's possible, and I'd forgotten the difference." She set the mug down. "I hadn't forgotten Evan. That's not what I mean. I mean, I'd forgotten that there was a version of a life that had more in it than surviving the next season." Gideon said quietly, "Maeve, let me finish." He waited. "I'm saying yes," she said, "to whatever you're asking. I'm saying yes before you ask it, because I don't want to sit across from you performing consideration when I've already considered it and I know the answer." She met his eyes directly, the way she did everything, without flinching, without softening it unnecessarily. "I want you to come back. I want Lena to grow up here. I want—" She stopped, and something crossed her face that was private and briefly unguarded. "I want there to be something here worth coming back to. And I think there already is, and I think you think so too." The kitchen was very quiet. Gideon looked at this woman across the table, her hands rough from winter work, her face carrying the particular weathered competence of someone who had demanded a great deal of herself for a long time, her eyes steady and a little afraid, which she would not admit and which he honored by not pointing to. "I'm going to Dunmore," he said, "and then I'm coming back. And when I come back, I'm asking you to marry me." He held her gaze. "That's what I'm saying." She was quiet for a moment. "That's 2 separate things." "Yes." "You're not asking me now. I'm telling you what I'm going to ask when I come back." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite the smile she almost never gave, but something adjacent. "That's a fine distinction. I'm a precise man." "You are not a precise man," she said, with the specific certainty of someone who had watched him work for 5 months. "You're a thorough man. Those aren't the same thing." "All right," he said. "I'm a thorough man who is going to come back from Dunmore and ask you to marry him." She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up her coffee. "I'll have an answer ready. she said. Telling Lena was its own event. He did it that afternoon, sitting on the fence rail of the south pasture where she'd gone to check whether the early grass was showing yet under the snowmelt. It was, barely, thin green threads in the mud that she'd been monitoring daily with the dedication of a scientist watching an experiment. She sat beside him and listened to what he said, and when he was done she was quiet for a while. He waited. He'd learned to wait with Lena. "You already talked to her," she said. "This morning." "What did she say?" "She said yes, basically." Lena looked at the pasture. "Basically," she repeated. "She said she'd have an answer ready when I came back." "That's a yes." "That's what I think, too." Lena was quiet again. He watched her from the side. The hat, the two coats she still wore out of habit, even though the temperature had moderated, the birthday gloves on her hands. She was looking at the grass threads with an expression he couldn't read immediately, which was unusual because he could usually read her. Then she said, "Mom would have liked her." He didn't answer right away. He thought about Clara. Not the photograph version, the real version, the woman who had been impossible in specific ways and remarkable in others, who had never once done the easy thing when the right thing was available, who would have looked at Maeve Holloway and recognized something she respected, even if she'd never say so directly. "I think that too," he said. Lena picked at the fence rail with one gloved finger. "Maeve's not like her." "No." "She's not trying to be either." "No," he said. "She's not." Another pause. "That's good," Lena said. "I think that's actually good, because if she was trying to be like Mom, it would be—" She searched for the word. "Sad, like a copy of something that doesn't need copying." He looked at his daughter. She was 12 years old, and she had just said something that had taken him considerably longer to arrive at. And she'd said it without apparent effort, the way children occasionally step past the places where adults are still working through. "Yeah," he said, "exactly like that." She leaned her shoulder against his arm. Not holding his hand, she was too old for that, she'd established this clearly, but close, the way she'd walked beside him through the snow on the night they'd arrived at the gate, shoulder to sleeve. "When do we leave?" she said. "Week, maybe less. I need to write to Margaret and tell her we're coming." "We," she said, testing it. "You and me. And Maeve, if she'll come." Lena looked up. "You're asking her to come with us?" "I'm asking her to meet the people we're going to see before I ask her to marry me. Seems right." He paused. "She might say no to that part. She doesn't leave the ranch easily." Lena considered this. "I'll ask her," she said. "Lena, you'll make it too formal. I'll just ask her." She slid off the fence rail. "She responds better to direct." He watched her walk back toward the barn with the specific, purposeful gait she'd developed here, different from the careful, contained way she'd moved when they'd arrived. She walked like someone who knew the ground under her feet and had opinions about where she was going. He sat on the fence rail a while longer, looking at the grass threads and the mud and the last of the winter snow retreating toward the tree line, and he thought that some things that look like endings are actually the ground clearing so something else can come through. "What?" Lena did ask Maeve. Gideon wasn't there for it. Lena had apparently timed it for when he was in the equipment shed, which was deliberate. But he heard about it from Cal, who had been in the barn and had the barn's reliable acoustic relationship with the kitchen. Lena just walked in and said, "We want you to come to Dunmore with us," Cal reported, with the satisfied expression of a young man who appreciated directness. And Miss Maeve said, "Who's we?" And Lena said, "Me and my dad." And Miss Maeve said, "Your father didn't mention it." And Lena said, Cal paused for dramatic effect, that he was too young to realize he was deploying. He was going to. "I just got here first." Gideon pressed his hand to his face. "And then what?" he said. And then Miss Maeve was quiet for a while, and then she said, "I'd need to arrange for Dolph to manage the ranch." And Lena said, Dolph can manage the ranch." And Miss Maeve said, "For how long?" And Lena said, "We'll be back before anything goes wrong." And Miss Maeve said, Cal seemed to find this part genuinely impressive. "You're very confident for someone who's never run a cattle operation." And Lena said, "I've been watching you." I learned it from you." Gideon sat down. "And then Miss Maeve said she'd think about it," Cal finished. "But she was—" He searched for the right word. "She looked like she was going to say yes. She had the yes face." "She has a yes face?" "She has a face she makes before she says yes to hard things. It's the same face she made before she agreed to go up the ridge." Cal shrugged. "I pay attention." Maeve said yes that evening. She said it to Gideon as though the conversation with Lena hadn't happened, as though she'd arrived at the decision through her own deliberation rather than being walked to it by an 11-year-old using her own logic against her, and Gideon respected this completely and said nothing about the other version. "Dolph can manage," she said. "A week, not more." "A week," he agreed. "I'm not going as—" She paused, looking for the right framing. "I'm not going as your companion. I'm going as someone who wants to understand what you're honoring before I become part of your life." He looked at her. "That's the right way to go," he said. She nodded, once, briskly, and the matter was settled. They left on a Thursday morning when the road was dry enough to hold the wagon without sinking. Dolph stood in the yard and received Maeve's instructions with his customary expressionless patience, and when she was done, he said, "I've heard all this before," which from Dolph was both accurate and a form of reassurance. Cal stood beside Dolph and waved at Lena with more feeling than he intended to show, and Lena waved back with the birthday gloves. The wagon moved east along the Ridgeback Road, and Gideon noticed as they passed the spot where the axle had given out in November that there was nothing visible to mark it. The road had been over it 100 times since. The snow had buried it and melted, and whatever urgency that moment had contained was now just a point on a road that looked like any other point on any other road. He thought about how that was actually how most turning points looked in retrospect. Ordinary from the outside. Everything from the inside. Maeve sat beside him on the wagon bench and looked at the country opening ahead of them with the specific attention of someone who didn't leave home often and was going to pay attention to what home looked like from a distance. She didn't talk much the first hour, which he didn't take as withdrawal. She was watching, filing, the way she did everything. Lena sat in the wagon bed with her back against the sideboard and her knees up and her hat pulled down, and she was, Gideon realized after half a mile, quietly singing to herself. Not a full voice, barely above a breath. Some song she'd picked up somewhere, possibly from Cal, who played a harmonica badly on winter evenings. The tune was unrecognizable, but the fact of it, the fact of his daughter singing under her breath in the back of a wagon, going somewhere, was a thing that landed in him softly and stayed. After the first hour, Maeve said, "The road is better than I expected." "The county put gravel on the lower section last fall," he said, "before the first snow." "I didn't know that." Hooper mentioned it. She was quiet for a moment. "You've been talking to Hooper." "He came by twice after the blizzard. We talked." She looked at him sideways. "About what?" "Ranch business, mostly. He's been running that spread since his father died. Some of the same problems: fence, water access, winter stock management." Gideon kept his eyes on the road. "He mentioned that the county has been talking about improving the road through the pass for 3 years and hasn't done it." "They won't do it," Maeve said. "They talk about the pass every year. Nothing happens." Hooper thinks if 3 or 4 ranches petition together, it might actually move. Maeve was quiet for a stretch. He could feel her thinking. "That would require getting Hendricks from the South property to agree," she said. "Hendricks doesn't agree with anyone about anything." "Hooper has a strategy for Hendricks." She looked at him. "You and Hooper have been busy." "It was conversation," he said. "I like knowing the country." She was quiet for another moment, and then she said with a dryness that was the closest thing she had to humor, "You've been here 5 months, and you know more of my neighbors than I do." "You know them," he said. "You just don't talk to them much." "I talk to them when it's necessary." Hooper would argue it's been necessary for about 3 years. She looked ahead at the road. "Hooper can argue whatever he wants," she said. But it wasn't sharp. It was the tone of someone filing information away, which meant she was actually considering it, which with Maeve was often indistinguishable from agreement. Lena's singing had stopped. Gideon glanced back and found her asleep against the sideboard with her hat over her face, Her gloved hands folded in her lap, moving with the rhythm of the wagon. He turned back to the road. Beside him, Maeve said quietly, "She's going to be something." "She already is," he said. Maeve didn't respond to this, but she shifted slightly on the bench, close enough that their shoulders were in contact, and she didn't move away from it. Dunmore was smaller than he'd expected from the letter's warmth. A settlement rather than a town. A mill. A general store. A church. A cluster of homes along a creek road that widened briefly into something that could generously be called a main street. Margaret Foss lived in a white house with a gray roof at the end of the creek road, and she was on the porch when they pulled up, as though she'd been watching the road for a while. She was Clara's age, or would have been, mid-30s, with Clara's coloring and Clara's way of moving her hands when she talked, and absolutely none of Clara's reserve. She came down the porch steps before they'd fully stopped, and she said, "Lena," not as a question but as a recognition, and Lena, who had woken up somewhere in the last mile and had been sitting up straight and quiet with the careful watchfulness of someone preparing for something significant, said, "Yes." Margaret stopped in front of her. She looked at Lena's face with the particular attention of someone finding resemblances, features they know from somewhere else. Her own face did something complicated and genuine, and she didn't hide it. "You look like her," she said, "around the eyes." Lena said, "People say that." "Does it bother you?" Lena thought about it with the seriousness she brought to honest questions. "No," she said. "I didn't know her well enough. I was little, but I like knowing she's in there somewhere." Margaret looked at her for another moment, and then pulled her into an embrace that Lena did not pull back from, which Gideon noted. His daughter was not casually physical. She'd inherited her father's caution about contact. That she accepted this one said something about the quality of Margaret's warmth, which was the unself-conscious kind that didn't ask permission because it assumed welcome and happened to be right. Margaret looked at Gideon over Lena's shoulder, and her eyes were wet, and she didn't apologize for it. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We promised," he said. She released Lena and looked at Maeve, who had descended from the wagon and was standing with the practiced composure of someone in an unfamiliar situation who is not going to betray that it's unfamiliar. Margaret extended her hand. "You must be Maeve. His letters mentioned you." Maeve shook her hand. "I hope what they mentioned was useful." "He said you saved his daughter this winter," Margaret said, "and that you were too practical to accept thanks gracefully." Maeve looked at Gideon. He looked at the wagon. "That's—" Maeve started. "Accurate," Lena said cheerfully, coming to stand beside Maeve. "It's accurate." They stayed 3 days, which was the week abbreviated to what was actually necessary once they were there, and the purpose of the visit became clear. The purpose, Gideon understood by the end of the first day, was not ceremony. It was continuity. Margaret wanted to know that Clara's daughter was real and present and cared for, and she wanted Lena to know that the part of her family she'd never met was also real and present. The two of them talked for hours. Gideon came in from helping Margaret's husband Thomas with some fence work. There was always fence work, and found Lena and Margaret at the kitchen table with Clara's letters spread between them. Margaret had kept all of them, years of them, and Lena was reading them with a focus that made her oblivious to his arrival. He backed out quietly. He found Maeve in the yard behind the house, standing at the fence looking at the creek. He came and stood beside her. "She's reading her mother's letters," he said. Maeve nodded. She was quiet for a moment. "Did you know about them?" "I knew Clara wrote to Margaret. I didn't know Margaret kept everything." Maeve looked at the creek. "That's a good thing," she said, "for Lena." "Yes." Another silence. The creek was running high with snowmelt, brown and fast at the edges, clear in the center. A late afternoon sun was moving in and out of clouds, throwing the yard into alternating warmth and shadow. Maeve said, "She was a good mother." He looked at her. She was still watching the creek. "Clara," she said, "from what Lena is, you can see it in her." She paused. "That doesn't happen without someone putting it there." He was quiet for a moment. "Clara was, yes, she was good at the parts of it that counted. She wasn't good at everything. Nobody is." He paused. She would have been better as Lena got older. I think about that sometimes. You can't know that. No, but I think it. Maeve was quiet. Then she said, I'm not trying to. I know I'm not what she was. I'm not trying to fill a space. He turned to look at her profile. I know that. I just want you to know I understand what you're carrying, she said. You and Lena. I'm not asking you to set it down. It goes with you, and so it goes with me, if… She stopped. If, he said. She looked at him. The afternoon sun was on her face, and she looked tired in the way of someone who had spent a long time being tougher than necessary. And she looked, too, like someone standing at the edge of something they'd decided to step off of despite being afraid of the drop. He reached into his coat pocket. He'd had it for 3 weeks, since a Thursday afternoon in mid-March when he'd ridden to Millhaven for fuel and gone by the jeweler's shop on the main street with the specific vague idea that he might look and nothing more, and had come out 40 minutes later with something wrapped in cloth that he'd been carrying since. He held it out. It was plain, not elaborate, a narrow gold band with a single small stone, nothing showy, the kind of thing a working woman could wear and not worry about. He'd thought about her hands when he chose it, the kind of thing her hands would tolerate. Maeve looked at it. She didn't reach for it immediately. I told you I was going to ask when we came back, he said. We haven't come back yet. I know. He held her gaze. I changed my mind about waiting. I decided I'd rather ask you here, where you've come somewhere new and still look like yourself. So I know it's you saying yes, not the ranch saying yes. She looked at him for a long moment. The creek ran behind them, and the sun moved behind a cloud and came back. She reached out and took the ring from his palm. She held it, looked at it, turned it once. Then she looked at him with the expression she saved for things she was going to say without softening and without taking back. Yes, she said, the same yes I told you in the kitchen. It hasn't changed. She slid the ring onto her finger. It fit, not perfectly, slightly loose, the way things are when someone guesses at a size from watching rather than measuring. She closed her hand around it once, as if checking that it was real. You guessed the size. I looked at your hand, he said, when you weren't paying attention. She made a sound he had never heard from her before. A short, genuine, surprised laugh, quickly contained, but real. That's something Cal would do, she said. Cal taught me, he said. She shook her head, but she was almost smiling, the near smile he'd catalogued since December. And she looked down at her hand with the ring on it and then up at him. And whatever she was going to say next, she didn't say, because Lena appeared at the back door of the house and stopped. Lena looked at her father. She looked at Maeve. She looked at Maeve's hand. She said, That's new. Maeve held her hand up slightly. Lena came off the porch and walked across the yard and stopped in front of them and looked at the ring with the careful inspection she brought to mechanical things, checking it from multiple angles. Then she looked at Maeve. It fits, she said. Close enough, Maeve said. Lena nodded the way she nodded when something met her standards. Then she looked at her father with an expression that was 12 years old and also somehow much older, the particular expression of a child who has understood something about how the world works that most adults pretend is more complicated than it is. Good, she said, and went back inside to Margaret's kitchen and her mother's letters. They drove home on a Saturday, the 1st of April, which was not lost on any of them. The road back was different from the road out in the way that return journeys are always different. Not the road, but the traveler. Gideon drove, and Maeve sat beside him with her hand resting on the bench between them, and occasionally, on the smoother sections of road, his hand resting over hers. Lena was in the back again, but this time she wasn't sleeping. She was watching the country go by with her arms over the sideboard, the gloved hands hanging, her face open to the wind coming off the last of the snow on the higher elevations. She had a small bundle on her lap, wrapped in cloth. Margaret had given her a packet of Clara's letters. Not all of them, but the ones that talked about childhood, about the people they'd both known, about the small particular details that made a life specific rather than general. She had held the bundle carefully since they left Dunmore, not reading it in the wagon. just keeping it. Gideon watched her in the mirror of his attention without turning to look, and he thought about what she was carrying and what she would do with it, how she would find a place to put it, how the letters would become part of the picture she was building of where she came from, how that picture would never be complete, and how she would learn, as all people do, to live with the incomplete picture and love it anyway because it was hers. He thought about what Maeve had said at the creek. It goes with you, and so it goes with me. He thought it was one of the truest things he'd ever heard said about what it meant to become part of someone's life rather than a replacement for part of it. Not starting over, starting from here, with everything that was already in the room. Maeve beside him said quietly, Cal will have run Dolph sideways with questions. Probably. Dolph will have answered 3 of them. Sounds right. The spotted mare's hoof will need checking. I should have had Dolph do it Thursday. You told him Thursday. She looked at him. I told him Wednesday. Maeve, you told him Thursday. I was there. She considered this. I meant to tell him Wednesday. I know. You told him Thursday. She let out a breath. The thrush can move fast in wet weather. We'll check her when we get back. She looked at the road ahead. I've been running that ranch alone for 4 years, she said, not with self-pity, just with the tone of someone realizing something. 4 years, and I never once left it for more than a day. How does it feel? He said. Being away from it. She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about anything. Wrong and right at the same time, she said. Wrong because it's not where I should be, and I know everything that needs doing. Right because, she paused, because I'm coming back to it, and that feels different from just being there. He understood this. The difference between a place you're in and a place you're returning to was the difference between having it and choosing it, and the choice was the thing that made it mean something. We're going to fix the creek bridge, he said. Before summer. She looked at him. Before summer is aggressive. I looked at it on the way down. The left support isn't rotted through yet. If we get to it in April, we can fix it right instead of replacing it entirely. That's a 2-day job at least. Probably 3, he said. I'll have Cal and Dolph. She was quiet for a moment. You've already planned it. I've been thinking about it since January. She shook her head slightly. Not the head shake of objection. The one that meant she was revising the picture she had of him, which happened with some regularity and which he suspected she found exasperating and also not entirely unwelcome. Thorough, she said. You've mentioned. The wagon went around the long curve that brought the ridge into view, and then, below the ridge, the first visible landmark of home, the water tower at the Callahan spread to the west, then the junction, then their own road winding north toward the tree line. Maeve straightened slightly on the bench, the unconscious posture adjustment of someone seeing their territory from a distance. There, she said. Just that. He followed her eyes. He could see the ranch before they were close enough to see details. The shape of it against the ridge, the dark line of the barn, the square of the house. As they came closer, the details arrived. The yard light was on even in the afternoon, which meant Dolph or Cal had forgotten it, and the south gate was open, which was fine for daytime but would need closing before evening. The spotted mare was visible in the near pasture, moving well on all 4 feet. From the back of the wagon, Lena said, It looks the same. It is the same, Maeve said. We've only been gone 3 days. A ranch doesn't change in 3 days, Maeve said. It changes season by season, the slow way. Lena considered this. Is that good or bad? Maeve thought about it honestly, the way she answered things Lena asked her. Depends what you're hoping for, she said. If you want fast change, it's frustrating. If you want something that holds... She looked at the barn, the fence line, the house with its stone foundation. It's about the best thing there is. Lena looked at the ranch the rest of the way in. Cal came out of the barn when they pulled through the gate, and Dolph appeared behind him, and Cal's face did the thing it did when he was genuinely relieved but didn't want it to show, which meant the relief showed twice as clearly. He looked at Lena. Lena looked at him. She held up her hand with the birthday gloves. Still have them, she said. I can see that, he said. He helped her down from the wagon and then immediately went to help Gideon with the horses, because he was 17 and helpfulness was less embarrassing when it could be attached to a task. Dolph looked at the wagon, at Gideon, at Maeve's left hand where the ring was, and said nothing. Then he said, "Mare's hoof is better. Did it Thursday like you said." He walked back to the barn. Gideon looked at Maeve. She looked at the ground. "Thursday," she said quietly. "Thursday," he confirmed. She pressed her lips together in the way that was not quite a smile and walked toward the house. That evening, after supper, beans, which no one complained about, and a dried apple pie that Dolph had apparently constructed without announcing his intentions, and set in the center of the table with the understated manner of a man who expected no commentary, Gideon sat on the porch steps as he had on that first November evening when Maeve had told him he could stay until spring. The air was cold still, would be cold for weeks yet, but the cold had changed character. It was April cold now, which meant it was apologetic about itself, retreating when the sun came out and returning at night without the full conviction of winter cold. The yard mud was drying at the edges. The spotted mare in the pasture was visible in the last light, moving without favoring her foot. Maeve came out and sat beside him, not across from him, not inside, beside him on the steps, close enough that their arms touched. She had a mug and she passed it to him without asking, and he drank from it and handed it back. They sat like that for a while. He thought about the night he'd sat on these same steps and looked at the stars and felt spring as a possibility rather than a fact, and how everything that had happened between that night and this one had happened. Not because he'd planned it, but because he'd shown up every day and done the work in front of him, and the work had turned out to include more than fence posts and axle housings and frozen water troughs. The work had included this woman beside him, this child inside doing something with her mother's letters that would take years to fully understand. These people, Dolph and Cal, Hooper down the road, even Raymond, who had ridden away from a fence line with something different in his face than what he'd arrived with. None of it was what he'd set out to find. He'd set out to keep a promise and survive the winter and get his daughter to Dunmore in the spring. That was the entire plan. He understood now that the best things rarely fit the plan. They happen in the margins of it, in the detours forced by broken axles and closed passes and storms that strand people in places they didn't intend to stay. Maeve said, "The petition for the road improvement." He looked at her. "Talk to Hooper," she said. "I'll write to Hendricks." I know something Hooper doesn't know about Hendricks, which is that he responds better to letters than to conversation because conversation gives him room to argue and letters make him think before he does. When did you figure that out? I've known Hendricks for 15 years. She looked at the tree line. I just haven't needed anything from him before. He looked at her. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about a lot of things, she said. The road matters. A better road means reliable supply. Means the county surveyor can come more easily if we need him. Means... She stopped. Means what? She looked at her hands around the mug. The ring caught the last of the light. Means Lena can get to a school if there's ever a school worth getting to, she said. There's talk of one in Millhaven, a proper one. She's too smart for what I can teach her. He was quiet for a moment. You've taught her more than you think. I've taught her the ranch, Maeve said. She needs more than the ranch. She should have more than the ranch. He looked at this woman and thought about what it cost her to say that. Not the saying of it, the believing it. The willingness to look at a child who was not hers and want more for her than what was immediately available. The willingness to see a future that included other people's needs before her own. He put his arm around her shoulders. She didn't lean in dramatically, didn't make it a moment, just settled slightly against him the way a person settles into something they've been moving toward for a long time without admitting the direction. Inside, through the kitchen window, lamplight. Lena's silhouette at the table, still with the letters, reading slowly. Cal washing up, moving back and forth across the window. Dolph's solid shape somewhere toward the back. The ranch breathed around them in the way working places breathe at the end of the day. Settling, cooling, the sounds of animals and structure, and accumulated human effort going quiet but not entirely still. Maeve said, We should write to the county recorder about the 1903 document. If Raymond is withdrawing the filing, I want the file clean. In the morning, he said. In the morning, she agreed. The stars were coming out above the ridge, not all at once. They appeared the way good things appear, one at a time, until suddenly there were enough of them to see by. Gideon did not know what the next season would bring. He knew the bridge needed fixing before summer, and the south fence had 2 more sections that would give in the next hard winter, and that Maeve's barometer needed a new glass because the current one had a hairline crack that would compromise the reading by fall. He knew Lena would grow, and whatever she grew into would surprise him and not surprise him in equal measure. He knew Raymond was not entirely done being Raymond, and that the county would continue to be slow about the road, and that the spotted mare would have her good days and her bad ones. He knew none of it would be smooth. He'd stopped expecting smooth a long time ago, back when smooth turned out to be what you told yourself when you were afraid of what rough actually required of you. What rough required was this: showing up, doing the work, staying on the roof in the wind until the vent cap came loose, coming down the ridge with 4 people when you went up with 2. Sitting at a kitchen table with your hands around a coffee mug and telling someone the true thing instead of the manageable one. It turned out that was enough. Not always. Not without cost. But enough. The mug passed back and forth between them once more, and neither of them said anything about the future, because the future was a thing you built one fence post at a time, and the posts were solid, and the ground was thawed, and tomorrow was morning. That was sufficient. That was, in the end, everything.